Welcome to a special edition of the podcast, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Jacob, will we ever leave the EU?
I assume that we will, because although there are many people who didn't want to leave and still resent the result, and a lot of them seem to be in the House of Commons, as yet they're not brave enough to stand up and say this. So a lot of people are talking about delaying our departure, and that is code, in my view, for saying they want to block the referendum, they want to overturn the biggest democratic exercise in our nation's history. But as yet they're not brave enough to say it, and I think that tells you something. I think that they recognise that there is no political mood to reverse Brexit.
Despite some would say the polls say that it's marginal, or even a slight margin in favour of staying in, some polls.
John Curtis, who writes regularly for the Telegraph, seems to be saying that there is no fundamental change in public opinion, and it's all to do with differentials in turnout, and that people who didn't bother to vote last time might vote this time if there were to be a second referendum. As it happens, I think if there were to be a second referendum, part of the fact it would be enormously divisive and wouldn't settle anything, because whichever way it went, people would probably ask for another referendum. People would vote on the issue of democracy and the "we've told you once" line, rather than on the benefits of the European Union.
I think that is a catchphrase, isn't it, for the second campaign? Why don't you listen to us the second time round?
It would be contemptuous of public opinion if politicians said, well, we said it was a final referendum, but because we don't like the decision, it is only a semi-final referendum.
What's your take on these cabinet ministers who are attacking the idea of a no deal? You know, Amber Rudd, David Gauke, Greg Clark, and others.
Well, I think the principle of collective responsibility is a central one to how our constitution works, that Parliament needs to be able to hold the government to account, and to do that you need to know what government policy is, and to know what policy is, it has to be a united policy amongst the whole of the government, and the convention is that ministers don't speak outside their own area because of this, and I think breakdown in that convention is deeply unhelpful. But the individuals you mentioned must also look at the manifesto that they supported. Did they, in 2017, issue caveats and say, we don't accept page whatever it is of the manifesto that says no deal is better than a bad deal, or that we should leave the customs union and the single market? If they said that to their voters, then they are behaving in good faith. If they didn't say that to voters, they must examine their consciences.
Do you think it's double standards? I mean, the media would all be all over a group of Brexiteers if they behaved in that way, wouldn't they, for example?
Well, I think
they got away with it almost.
There is a certain sympathy for Alberto Costa, who had resigned as a PPS for putting down a motion that turned out to be government policy. But
that was on the issue of EU nationals.
But the very important issue of
his parents are Italian with Italian passports.
And it's something where most people in Parliament have always wanted EU nationals or EU member state nationals living in this country to be treated well. So there was an incongruity in that.
And what do you think about that incongruity?
Incongruities are not always the best form of government.
No, and it did expose Theresa May for her weak position on Brexit, didn't it? The fact she couldn't act against those three.
Well,
or didn't.
The Prime Minister doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons, and that is a fundamental problem. And that's always a problem. Minority governments are always difficult.
What would you do if you were Prime Minister? Because some think you could be a Prime Minister.
I don't think very many people think that.
Let's say I think you might be Prime Minister one day. What would you do if you were in charge 5 days away from this existential vote on Tuesday?
Well, the government is the government, and that is important to remember, and Parliament is Parliament. And what do I mean by that? There are established norms between the legislature and the executive. In terms of discussions with foreign countries, that is carried out by the government, not by Parliament. And therefore any talk of an extension is a matter for the government, not ultimately for Parliament, unless Parliament would repeal the Withdrawal Act, which there is no demand to do. So I think the government should be clear and firm, and should deliver on what people voted for. And if that means leaving without an agreement, it means leaving without an agreement. I would not be frightened of that.
If you, who do you blame most for where we are? I mean, I was likening it to Homes Under the Hammer. Imagine you have some TV. Do you watch Homes Under the Hammer? I don't know if you watched that. It's a TV
I've
program.
Heard of it. I've heard of it.
So
I have a television.
A couple.
I watch.
Do you?
Yes, very regularly.
We'll come to that later. A couple give an idea of what house they want: a sea view on a cliff, a nice view of a night, in say in East Anglia. Then the people go away and come back with options.
Cliff in East Anglia. It's very flat.
Well, they might fall off there, but still with a nice aspect, and they come back with a semi in Salford or something. I mean, if that were to happen, you'd sack the presenters, wouldn't you, of the programme? So how have we got to a position where over 200 MPs vote against the solution to Brexit after 2 years? It's insane.
I think the problem with the deal is that it ties us too heavily into the European Union, and the negotiations have been very, very badly handled from day one. The agreement of sequencing that the EU demanded should never have been given. The agreement to solve the financial aspect before the details of the rest of the settlement was the utmost of folly. That the last thing you should agree is the price, because that's where, if you're the buyer, you have the negotiating strength. So I think there's a whole catalogue of errors throughout the process.
Who do you blame for that? The PM not being a Brexiteer is a big issue for many people.
I think the Prime Minister not being a supporter of leaving the European Union has inevitably coloured the way the negotiations were carried out, because it seems the Prime Minister's policy has been to remain closely aligned with the European Union, which is not what people who voted to leave wanted.
And she won't say she'd back Brexit even today, if asked, which is, I always think, is a real problem for her.
But in any governmental system, the head of the government must take responsibility for government policy. So even if the Prime Minister had negotiated brilliantly, and this genuinely were the best deal that the EU was ever going to give, if people in this country still think it's a bad deal, that is inevitably the Prime Minister's responsibility. That's the way our system works.
According to Anna Soubry and others, the ERG run the government. Is that the case?
Many people might think it's a great pity that we don't run the government, because we wouldn't have this agreement if we did. No, that was an extraordinary overstatement of the reality of the situation.
I was going to ask you if that were the case, what are the options that might come back next week?
Well, if that were the case at this stage, I hope wouldn't be starting from here, but if we got to this stage, my advice would be to go full steam ahead for leaving without an agreement on the 29th of March. I think the Prime Minister's promised that we will leave on the 29th of March over 100 times, and I expect that promise to be fulfilled.
What will the reaction be, do you think, when it seems inevitable, I think, that we won't leave on the 29th of March? What will the reaction be amongst... There are marches planned from Sunderland to London ahead of that time, and I think there might be some real anger out there.
Let's wait and see. Let's see what Geoffrey Cox comes back with. Let's see how the votes go next week. It's still possible that we leave on the 29th of March, and I don't want to speculate about what may happen if the country is let down.
You're a betting man. You work in the city.
No, I'm not a betting man. No, that's just...
You have a city business.
Yes, but the city is not betting. It is making considered investments, having weighed up all the facts. It's not going to the races. And
you'd invest in Britain after a no-deal Brexit?
Oh, I think investment in the United Kingdom looks extremely attractive at the moment, yes. I think there's a lot of good value here, and of course a lot of international stocks based in the UK.
You were criticised, of course, for moving part of your business to Dublin, weren't you?
But that was completely fanciful. My business has not moved to Dublin.
But you put an operation in Dublin?
No, we haven't put an operation in Dublin. That's just not true.
Right, okay.
If even you...
No, forgive me, but please
simply wrong. We have set up a fund that is domiciled in Dublin, but we have funds in Singapore, Australia, New Zealand,
in different tax regimes.
Well, in regimes that clients want, and Ireland and Luxembourg are the two most popular European jurisdictions, regardless of Brexit. That's been the case.
Because of corporation tax, or?
No, basically because of their regulatory base and the rules they have around setting up new funds, that it's cheaper to do in Ireland by and large than other countries, but also clients are used to Irish and Luxembourg funds, and therefore there's strong client demand for funds in those jurisdictions, whereas UK funds tend only to be bought by UK nationals. Irish and Luxembourg funds tend to be marketable around the world.
You've been re-adopted as Tory candidate for North East Somerset. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Activists across the country are pushing to remove Remain supporting Tory candidates, Tory MPs. Are they right?
I think the Tory Party needs to remain a broad church. I think that we've never been a party of ideological purity. There are perfectly respectable Conservatives who hold different views on the European question from the ones I hold, and I would not be in favour of a purge. No, not a purge, but the odd ones being removed. Don't you think there's a right amongst some concerned activists, if they feel their MPs and doing what they thought they were campaigning for in 2017? Members of Parliament Conservative members of Parliament are accountable to their associations. That is true and that is right. And sometimes the relationship between members of Parliament and their associations breaks down.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that if this is purely about European ideology, that would be unfortunate and not in the best traditions of the Conservative Party.
There may be other issues too we don't know about.
I mean, if you look at the history of deselections, it's usually not ideological, it is personality based,
Yes.
and that sometimes happens. But I think for it to be ideological would be very unfortunate. And bear in mind, the boot could always be on the other foot. In the 1990s, if it had been ideological, it would have been people like me who would have faced deselection, and the Tory Party wouldn't have had the Eurosceptics to wave the flag when the issue came to the fore. So I would not be in favour of ideological selections or deselections.
Just finally, did you read Emmanuel Macron in The Guardian this week? He talked about his plans for Europe.
There's sort of two things that I'm unlikely to read. One is The Guardian, and the other is Monsieur Macron's view for Europe. We will have left, so that will not be my business.
I asked some questions on Twitter. I said, what would you like to ask Jacob Rees-Mogg? I got some to ask you now. Is that okay?
Yes, but I hope the messages from your sponsors have been enjoyed by your listeners. It's a commercial operation.
Well, we have to wash our face somehow.
Absolutely, that Dove soap or whatever it is has been advertised.
Thank you. Pavlo Marx asks, what are you?
Who, why, or what is
I don't know.
SWAT?
I don't know. What are you, Jacob Rees-Mogg? That was the question.
That's a very peculiar
I
question.
know. This is Twitter for you. They live in caricatures, possibly. You're a Tory.
I am a Tory. What do they want to know?
A father of many.
That's right. My biography can be read on Wikipedia if people want to see it. No, not entirely accurate, but fair enough, most of it. So I am a Conservative Member of Parliament for North East Somerset in my public life. Yeah.
And Bill Rogers asks, can you name a single competent, honourable cabinet minister?
Yes, I can. Lots.
Name one.
Damien Hines happens to be a very old friend of mine, deeply honourable, good man. Damien and I have discussed the European issue without enormous agreement over decades, but he is a first-class individual and an honourable person.
How do you square this sort of sellout amongst many we see about on Brexit in the cabinet with that friendship you describe?
Well, I think people have different opinions as to the quality of the withdrawal agreement, and that is part of politics, and people are entitled to do that. Just because somebody disagrees with you does not make him dishonourable.
But Twitter would disagree, because Twitter leaps to judgment very quickly, as you know.
Well, it only has a certain number of characters, and it's perhaps difficult to put a nuanced argument in whatever it is, 240 characters.
Yes. Joshua Nako asked, what are the top 3 British issues you will throw your energies into after Brexit? What's your focus after Brexit?
I think the biggest issue for the country after Brexit, and actually already, is housing. And how do we solve the housing crisis? And we need to build more, and that means looking at the restrictions that we have, looking at the whole planning system, looking at land that could be freed up from the government, and that would be my number one issue.
Even on the green fields of North East Somerset?
Even on the green fields of North East Somerset, but there is a purpose to the green belt. I'm not sure that all of the green belt is good green belt, but there is some green belt that is. So you need to look at it carefully to see, does it serve the purpose of stopping urban sprawl, or is it essentially a brownfield site that has been frozen in aspic for no very good reason? So I think you need to review that. But your correspondent wanted 3 issues, and I'm only giving one. I think we need to look at our tax system, which has become extraordinarily cumbersome and is making the country less competitive. And we know from corporation tax that where you cut taxes you can easily get more revenue. And the third area is we've got to continue with the education reforms, which have been of such benefit to people in this country, and what Michael Gove did and what Damien Hines
more grammar schools, or?
Oh, well, I think continuing the programme of academisation and improving standards, but also looking more at vocational education. I had somebody come to House of Commons from Radstock earlier this week who is doing an apprenticeship scheme, and having more apprentices is a really good way of motivating people who may get left behind in other streams of education.
On tax, you want to see lower tax across the board, I imagine. But are we too taxed in this country?
We're much too heavily taxed. We're up to about our highest level since 1970.
43%, or
if you take total tax take of GDP, now it's not as high as 43%. It's heading towards 40%.
Well, yeah.
And this is too high, and it makes us.
Where do you bring it down to? It's nearer 30.
Well, I think what you need is to set the rates which then allow the economy to grow, so that you have the money that you need from a bigger economy. It's back to Margaret Thatcher's view that you grow the cake rather than re-slicing the cake.
I was struck by the criticism of the TIG, the independence group. Sarah Williston, one of the new joiners there, said that the government is right wing. Do you think it's a Tory right wing government? I don't see the evidence in that.
There is no evidence for that. The government is.
They're banning stuff. They're raising taxes when they need. I mean, it doesn't seem very right wing to me.
I don't think the government is right wing. I agree with you. There is no evidence for it. But people bandy about these terms that they view as terms of abuse because they think it gives them political advantage. I don't think one should examine them too carefully.
But they see Brexit as a right wing project, don't they?
Which is wrong, because Brexit is as much a left-wing project as a right-wing project, but fundamentally it's a question of democracy. Should we be ruled by our own voters, or should we be ruled by bureaucrats?
And last week's podcast, we had the economists on who were supporting Brexit.
Do you find any?
Yes, they were on the podcast last week.
Well, I'm sorry I missed that, but it's very hard to get on your app, which I would encourage you to put it on the daily app so people can tune in more easily.
Jake Watts asked, how are you younger than Will Smith? Do you know who Will Smith is?
I haven't met Mr. Smith, no.
No, he's an actor.
Oh, is he?
I think it's because you dress older, don't you? But I mean, that's not your fault. You don't wear some baseball caps and.
I don't wear baseball caps. Why would I?
I don't know why.
No.
This is Twitter.
All right. Yes, I can't help this gentleman.
No, Beastly and Brexy says a serious question. Given your growing popularity, have you considered, in all seriousness, standing for PM after 5 years? In 5 years' time?
No, I haven't. I'm a backbench member of Parliament.
You are now. You have no plans.
I have no plans.
Would you rule it out on the podcast?
You ask me this every time I come on. Look, I'm a backbench member of Parliament. There is no vacancy. There no doubt will be a vacancy at some point, but I think it's important that people like me leave supporting Conservatives back a strong Leave candidate, and that throwing my hat in the ring would merely divide the Eurosceptic vote.
Yeah. There's a familiar one here from Guy Mandrell. He says, do you have concerns that the referendum was unduly influenced by a Russian disinformation campaign? And do you have any problem with the degradation of truth in public life in the UK? Well, the first one is more pointed about Russia. Do you think Russia had an influence over the campaign?
No, I think it's completely bogus. I think people who lost like to blame the Russians. There's no evidence that Russia determined the Brexit result. People voted to leave because they wanted to take back control, and they did so as free citizens of this country. And I think when you talk about disinformation, one of the bits of disinformation is blaming everything on Russia. I happen to think that President Putin is extremely dangerous, and we need to treat Russia with great caution. But you can't blame everything you don't like on Russian secret attempts that they didn't hide in ballot boxes and put crosses on Leave.
Yes. Just finally, ID and Kurt Alley asked, what's your messages to Welsh hill farmers and auto engineers at Honda? He obviously sees both those groups being badly affected by Brexit, although the Honda decision is not actually a Brexit result, is it?
No, that's absolutely right. Honda has nothing to do with Brexit, as the company itself made clear.
But there'll be some losers from Brexit, won't there? That's his point. Do you worry about those people?
Well, what do you mean by losers? Under what circumstances?
Well, he's suggesting there that Welsh hill farmers might lose funding to help support their farms.
But that's not the case, is it? That the government has made it clear that agricultural subsidies will continue, and so that won't be a problem for Welsh hill farmers. The issue may be about trade. If we were to leave without a deal, there may be tariffs imposed
on lamb going.
That's right. And if that were to happen, then the government would have a duty to help people particularly affected, and that would be lamb farmers. But there is no direct causal link between Brexit and harm to hill farmers.
I was trying to solve Brexit on Twitter the other night, and I got attacked by people who didn't like the idea. But why not just leave on the 29th of March and just agree to abide by EU rules for 21 months? So we're out of the EU, we can do trade deals, and we agree to abide by their rules.
Well, that's basically the Malthouse 2 proposal. I think that
Is that a sensible idea?
I think it's a perfectly reasonable idea, because I think on that basis you can continue trading on the current arrangements and would allow time for the future relationship to be developed.
And we use the money to support that we save to support hill farmers or whoever needs the money.
Well, there would be no change in their circumstance, so you wouldn't need to use the money for that. You could actually pay money to the EU as proposed under the implementation plan to buy a standstill. I think that's quite an intelligent view, but then of course it was yours, so it's bound to be.
Jacob, I've got some quick fire questions for you.
Oh yes.
Okay. Have you ever been to Nando's?
No.
Do you want to go to Nando's?
No.
Have you been asked to go to Nando's?
No.
Why not?
I believe it's a rather unpleasant type of chicken. I would rather eat chicken at home.
What's your favourite pop band?
I don't have one.
What's your favourite type of music?
Either religious or opera.
And you don't listen to the charts?
No, do they still exist?
The charts do exist.
Do they?
Downloads.
The Hit Parade.
Hit Parade, yes.
Delighted to hear it.
What was the last book you read?
What's the last book I read? Well, actually last night I was reading Smith Journalist, which is a very funny Woodhouse, but I've always got 2 or 3 books on.
Is that how you relax with a Woodhouse at night?
Not every night, but I often read Woodhouse, but I usually have a number of books on the go.
Who would be your ideal dinner party guests? Let's say 6.
6 dinner party guests. What's the remit? Can one go from...
No, it's your ideal dinner party.
You can go from the whole of history, can you?
Yes, alive or dead.
Alive or dead, and let's exclude people who are divine. So
yes.
And the mother
of
our
Jesus
Lord as well. So if you go to the normal run, who would it be interesting to see? Gosh, there are just so many. To get to 6 is quite difficult. But I think I should like to meet Pope Innocent III.
Right.
Who...
was he a reforming pope, was he?
He's a very important pope, and he's around the same time as John is King of England. He places England under an interdict, among other things.
Yeah.
So I think he would be interesting to meet, and would be my papal.
Yes. He'd say grace.
He would say grace. I would like to meet Alfred the Great, as I think the founder of our country would be important and fascinating to find out what his times were really like, and how accurate is Asser's life of Alfred. If we're having the founders of the country, then perhaps William the Conqueror, though one feels he might slightly dominate the conversation.
Or fall out with Alfred. But you keep
he would fall out.
Different end of the table.
That's right, you keep them different end of the table. You've got a pope in between,
so
keeping order.
Yeah.
I'm allowed 3 more, aren't I?
Yes.
I think we'd better have Queen Elizabeth I.
Yes, of course.
As a very formidable figure.
Catholic Queen.
No, Elizabeth
No, sorry, I'm thinking of Mary Queen of Scots. I think the film. We'll delete that one.
Yes. Mary Queen of Scots would add some glamour.
Yes.
But I've also
it would be a
frosty. I think it would be a tricky
meal.
evening with Mary Queen of Scots and Elizabeth I. So let's not invite her. I should like to invite Thomas Wentworth, who mainly because my wife's descended from him, and he's a most interesting figure, and of course Charles I's most significant advisor, who possibly could have changed the result of the Civil War.
Yep.
And I've got one left, and I've just been listening on audiobooks to Andrew Roberts' biography of Churchill, which is magnificent. I know you've already had messages from your sponsors, but I've had my own message. Anyone listening, do buy and read Andrew Roberts' book. It's really
Is
good.
it Roberts or Churchill who'd be your final guest?
Churchill.
Oh, Churchill, of course.
Yeah, having read the book.
Yes, he has to come here.
Andrew, I think I might be allowed to have dinner with anyway.
Yes,
he might, as I've known him for some time. But no, to say Churchill would round it off.
That's a good evening. What's your biggest regret?
My biggest regret? I don't spend a lot of time regretting things.
So you regret Rianne?
No,
you're Norman Lamont in the bath.
No, I wouldn't say that. But the problem with regretting things is you can't just change one thing without changing everything. But if you could change one thing and keep everything else equal, I wish I were a younger father.
Really?
being nearly 40 when my eldest child was born, by the time my youngest child is 21, I will be 70, which I think is beginning to get on a bit. And I think, therefore, if I were to be able to keep all the same children and the same wife and not change anything else around it,
it would be
I would like to have started earlier.
Start earlier.
Yes.
Because of energy and being busy. How old are you now?
I shall be 50 in due course, not later this year.
Yes. But you feel exhausted. You've got six
No,
children.
no, I don't feel exhausted at all. It's just a question of being older.
Yes.
I think perhaps one can play cricket longer with one's children at 30 than one can at 50.
That's quite. Hunting, shooting or fishing?
Staying inside and reading a book, quite honestly.
Do you do any of those things?
No.
Nothing? No.
No. I'm basically idle.
No. Jeans or corduroy trousers?
Neither.
Neither?
No.
No, not cords?
No.
Have you ever been to a football match?
I have, yes. I went to see Keynsham Town beat Chippenham just after Christmas.
Yes.
Which is in my constituency.
Yes.
Keynsham Town were doing very well this year.
Were you chanting?
No, I wasn't chanting.
No. What was the last text you sent?
What was the last text I sent?
Was it an emoji? You don't do emojis?
No. Civilised people don't use emojis.
But you say yes.
But I do send text regularly.
And finally, final question is, what do you have for breakfast?
I almost never eat breakfast, so so far this morning I've had a number of cups of coffee. I haven't even eaten the biscuit that you have kindly placed in front of me.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, thanks again for coming on Chopper's Brexit podcast. It's going to be a big few days. What's your final message to listeners?
Oh, I think people must hold their nerve. It is a very important period. We will, in 3 weeks from the date of broadcast, be leaving the European Union, which will be a great release and joy and benefit for the nation. But between now and then, the Remainers will do everything they can to try and frustrate it. So,
it's a battle for Britain.
Well, I wouldn't put it in those terms.
For Britain.
But we must remain steady. Hearts of oak are our ships, jolly tars are our men, and we are always ready. Steady, boys, steady. I think my slogan would be steady, boys, steady.